The door of the Gable Mercantile closed with a sound like a breaking bone. It was a solid, final sound that separated Ilara from the only life she had ever known. Silas Gable, her brother-in-law, stood on the other side of that thick oak door, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He had done his duty as he saw it. He had followed the law, the mercantile, the small house behind it, the life she had shared with his brother. It all belonged to the Gable estate now, and the estate belonged to him. He had pressed $37 into her palm. A gesture of goodwill, he'd called it, his voice smooth and cold as riverstone. It was the price of her eviction, the severance for a decade of her life. The town of Providence Gulch watched. They stood on the boardwalks, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They saw a woman of 28, widowed a month past, being cast out with nothing but the clothes on her back and a worn leather satchel. They saw a tragedy, but one that was not their own. Inside the satchel was her inheritance, not from Silas, but from her late husband, Thomas. A deed, crisp and official, for a parcel of land nobody wanted. 10 acres of rock and scree up in the high country, purchased in a fit of romantic foolishness years ago. Thomas had called it their escape. The town called it Gable's Folly. It was considered worthless, a patch of wind-scoured granite and stunted pines, notable only for the collapsed entrance to a long-dead silver mine. "You cannot go there, Ilara," Mr. Finch, the assayer, had warned her, his voice heavy with genuine concern. "The wind will strip the flesh from your bones before the first snow. Take the coach east. Find work in a city." Others offered similar advice, all of it sensible, all of it born of a pity that felt like a shroud. They saw a woman broken by grief and circumstance, a problem to be solved with charity or distance. They expected her to weep, to beg, to collapse into the arms of the church ladies who stood by with platitudes and thin soup. Ilara did none of these things. She looked at the $37 in her hand, the sum total of her worldly value in the eyes of Providence Gulch. She felt the weight of their judgment, their certainty that she was doomed. A quiet, cold fury settled deep in her bones, a feeling harder and more enduring than grief. She turned her back on the closed door of the mercantile and walked not to the stagecoach office, but to the blacksmith's forge. There she spent $12 on a good felling axe with a hickory handle. At the general store, a rival to the Gable Mercantile, run by a man who held no love for Silas, she spent another 10 on a shovel, a sack of salt, a box of matches, and a small cloth bundle of winter seeds. She had $15 left. A man offered to sell her a ticket east for 14. She shook her head. With the axe over one shoulder and the shovel in her hand, she walked to the edge of town. Her husband's dog, a scruffy, loyal mutt named Boro, trotted silently at her heels. He was all that was left of Thomas, the only living creature who looked at her without a trace of pity. She did not look back. She fixed her eyes on the distant, sharp line of the mountains and began to walk. She was walking toward Gable's Folly, the worthless land that was now her only possession in the world. The journey was a punishment. The trail climbed out of the relative shelter of the gulch and onto the high plains, where the wind was a constant physical presence. It tore at her dress and stung her eyes. The weight of the axe and shovel settled into her shoulders, a deep burning ache that was still new. Boro stayed close, his head low, sensing the grimness of their purpose. For 2 days she walked. The landscape grew harsher, the soil thinner, the trees more gnarled and bent into permanent submission by the wind. She slept in the lee of rock outcroppings, wrapped in her thin shawl, with Boro pressed against her for warmth. She ate the last of the bread she'd carried and drank from cold, fast-running streams. The world of Providence Gulch, of warm beds and polite conversation, felt a lifetime away. This was a different reality, one of stone, wind, and survival. On the 3rd day she found it. The boundary markers were 2 iron stakes driven into the ground, bearing the faded initials of the surveyor, her 10 acres. And it was worse than she had imagined. It was not a plot of land. It was a wound in the earth, a steep, barren hillside of fractured granite with almost no topsoil to speak of. And there, halfway up the slope, was the mine. It was not a proper entrance, but a gaping, jagged hole, a place where the earth had simply given up and collapsed inward, leaving a chaotic jumble of rock, splintered timbers, and dead roots. This was her inheritance, a hole, a grave. The town was right. Mr. Finch was right. Silas was right. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. It was a physical blow, buckling her knees. She slid to the ground, the shovel clattering on the rocks beside her. What had she been thinking? Her defiance, her quiet fury, it all seemed like a child's tantrum in the face of this brutal, indifferent reality. Borrow nudged his wet nose into her hand and whined, a low, mournful sound that echoed her own desolation. She would die here. The wind would pick her bones clean, and in the spring a hunter might find her, a cautionary tale for the town to whisper about for years. Gable's folly, they would say, and they would be right. As the sun dipped below the peaks, the temperature plummeted. The cold came on like a thief, stealing the warmth from her body with brutal efficiency. Shivering, she scrambled toward the collapsed mine entrance. It was not a shelter, but it offered a slight break from the relentless wind. She huddled in the hollow of the collapse, pulling her shawl tight, Borrow curled into a shivering ball at her feet. The darkness was total, the silence broken only by the howl of the wind passing over the ridge. It was then, in the depths of her misery, that she noticed something. Borrow, who had been shivering violently, had gotten up. He was sniffing intently at the base of the rock wall, deep within the collapsed area. His tail gave a tentative wag. He pawed at a narrow fissure, a crack in the granite no wider than her hand, and then lay down beside it, his shivering ceasing almost entirely. Curiosity pierced through Ilara's despair. She crawled over the loose rock toward him. She placed her raw, cold hand over the fissure, and she felt it. She felt a faint but undeniable current of air, and it was warm, not hot, not even truly warm, but it was degrees above the freezing air around her. It was the steady, constant breath of the deep earth, a geothermal vent. Her heart gave a single, hard thump. She pressed her ear to the rock, listening. Deeper inside the collapse, beyond the choke of rock and timber, she heard another sound, a slow, rhythmic drip, 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 drip. It was the sound of water, clean and constant, insulated from the frost by the mountain itself. In that moment, everything shifted. The despair did not vanish, but it was forged into something else, something hard and sharp. Resolve. The town saw a worthless hole. The law saw a forgotten claim. But the earth had hidden a secret here. This was not a grave. It was a chance. The work began at dawn. It was brutal, mindless labor. Her first task was to clear a path through the debris choking the entrance. She used the shovel to move scree and loose dirt, and her own hands, which were soon raw and bleeding, to haul away stones. The splintered, half-rotten timbers were heavy and awkward. She strained, her muscles screaming in protest. Every movement was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. After 2 days of this punishing work, she had cleared a narrow tunnel just large enough to crawl through into a small cavern beyond the initial collapse. The air inside was still and markedly warmer than the outside. The drip of water was louder here, coming from a seam in the rock ceiling and pooling on the floor. The geothermal fissure ran along the base of one wall, a steady source of gentle warmth. This small cavern would be her home. She spent the next weeks enlarging it. The rock was fractured, and with the shovel and the butt of her axe, she could pry loose large chunks. She hauled them out one by one and began to stack them, building a thick, solid wall that sealed off the entrance she had cleared. She left a small opening for a door. It was slow, agonizing work. A single stone could take an hour to move into place. Her hands became a mass of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. She grew thinner, but her arms and back hardened into cords of muscle. She used the best of the old mine timbers to frame a door and a small window opening in her new wall. For the door itself, she felled one of the stunted pines with her axe, a task that took an entire day of sweat and cursing. She split the log into rough planks and lashed them together with rope she'd carried. It was a crude, heavy thing, but it was solid. When she finally heaved it into place, she felt a surge of triumph, so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. She had a door. She could shut the world out. Now she turned her attention to the systems that would keep her alive. She built her fire pit directly on the stone floor over the main geothermal fissure. The rising warmth from the earth meant her fire needed less fuel to burn hot. More importantly, she noticed a second, smaller fissure high up on the cavern wall. It created a faint but steady draft, pulling the smoke upwards and into the porous rock of the mountain. From the outside, there was no visible chimney, no plume of smoke to give her away. The mountain itself was her flue. For water, she spent a week chipping a shallow channel in the stone floor, guiding the steady drip from the ceiling into a natural depression in the corner of the cavern. She found a deposit of dense clay deeper in an old mine tunnel. She packed this clay into the depression, creating a waterproof cistern. Every day it filled with clear, cold water that never froze. Food was the next challenge. The land outside was barren, but the cavern held a different possibility. The temperature was stable, a constant cool but never freezing. She took the seeds she had bought and began an impossible garden. She hauled bag after bag of the thin topsoil from a sheltered hollow down the mountain, a back-breaking journey she made dozens of times. She mixed this with bat guano she discovered in an adjoining tunnel. In this manufactured earth, by the dim, flickering light of her fire and a single tallow lamp, she planted her seeds, potatoes, carrots, hardy kale, and mushrooms she cultivated on rotting logs. After a month of this relentless labor, she knew she needed more. She needed a source of protein that didn't rely on traps or luck. She needed livestock. Taking her remaining $15, she left Boro to guard her new home and made the long walk back to Providence Gulch. Her appearance caused a stir. She was gaunt and weathered, her hands scarred, her clothes ragged. But her eyes held a new light, a hardness that unsettled those who had pitied her. She walked into the general store, bypassing the Gable Mercantile, and bought 3 laying hens and a small, pregnant goat. The whispers followed her down the street. They called her Cave Girl now. Silas Gable stepped out of his emporium as she was tying the goat's lead. He looked her up and down, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Chickens, Ilara?" he said, his voice loud enough for half the town to hear. "Raising chickens on that rock pile? The wolves and coyotes will thank you for the feast." Ilara met his gaze. She said nothing. She simply finished her knot, paid her money, and began the arduous task of herding her small, noisy flock back up into the high country. The laughter at her back felt distant, irrelevant. They did not understand the world she was building. Boro was her shadow, her guard, her only comfort. He learned the routine of her days. He stood watch at the door while she worked, his low growl the only warning she needed of a passing predator. At night, he slept at the foot of her straw and blanket bed, a warm, living presence in the deep, silent dark. The bond between them, forged in shared loss, deepened in shared labor and isolation. He was her family. He was her heart. Back in her stone shelter, she built a small pen for the animals against the warmest wall near the main fissure. The constant, gentle heat from the earth meant they would survive the winter without burning through precious body fat just to stay warm. The chickens began to lay eggs, small miracles of protein she treated like jewels. The goat, placid and hearty, grew heavy with kid. Her subterranean world was becoming a functioning homestead. As autumn deepened, the mockery from the town solidified into a local legend. Her lack of a visible chimney was the primary source of speculation. "She's frozen solid by now," some said, with grim certainty. "Burning green wood and filling that hole with smoke," others guessed. "She'll be dead of lung fever by Christmas." Silas Gable encouraged these stories, painting a picture of his tragic, half-mad sister-in-law, a woman who had chosen a rocky grave over his generous charity. The name Fisher Witch began to stick, a term of dark amusement whispered over counters and hearths. One afternoon, a trapper named Brant, a rough man known for his loud opinions, rode his horse up the trail to her claim. He sat on his saddle, looking down at her crude stone wall and heavy door. "Heard you were living in a hole like a badger," he shouted, a cruel grin on his face. "Silas says you've lost your mind. Looks like he's right." Alara was splitting wood nearby. She didn't stop. She simply raised the axe, brought it down hard on a log, and watched the two halves fall cleanly away. She did not look at him. She did not give him the satisfaction of a reply. After a moment of awkward silence, Brant grunted and rode away, shaking his head. The first snows came, dusting the peaks, then blanketing the high country. Alara retreated into her fortress of stone. Her world shrank to the circle of firelight. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by necessity. Stoke the fire, water the animals, tend the pale green shoots in her garden, check the cistern, reinforce the chinking in the wall with fresh clay. The routine was a shield against the crushing solitude. Outside, the world was a canvas of white and gray. The wind was a constant mournful song. But inside, there was life. There was the soft clucking of the hens, the goat contentedly chewing her cud, the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, the steady drip of water into the cistern. Boro lay by the fire, his tail thumping a soft rhythm on the stone floor. She was utterly alone, but she was not helpless. She was the sovereign of this small, warm kingdom she had carved from the cold rock. Her systems faced their first true test in November. An early blizzard, a prelude to the winter to come, swept down from the north. For 3 days, the snow fell without pause. The wind piled it into massive drifts, burying her door completely. She was sealed in. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way into her heart. But her systems held. The fire drew perfectly. The animals were calm. She had food, water, and warmth. When the storm finally broke, she used her shovel to dig a tunnel up and out into a world of blinding white. The experience didn't break her. It hardened her resolve. Her shelter was strong. Another test came in the form of a wolf pack, driven down from the highest peaks by hunger. Boro's frantic barking woke her in the dead of night. She peered through a crack in the door and saw them, 6 pairs of yellow eyes, circling just beyond the reach of her lantern light. They clawed at the door, their hunger making them bold. But the thick planks held. The solid stone walls offered no purchase. After a terrifying hour, they gave up and melted back into the darkness. She leaned against the door, her heart pounding, and pressed her face into Boro's thick fur. They had survived. Then came the deep winter, the real winter. The people of Providence Gulch called it the Blizzard of '83, a name they would speak with reverence and fear for generations. It did not arrive like a normal storm, it descended like a judgment. The sky turned a bruised slate gray, and the wind began to scream, a high, thin sound that cut through the thickest wool. Then the snow came, not as flakes, but as a horizontal wall of white, a blinding, scouring force that erased the world. The temperature fell past 0, then 10 below, then 20. It was a cold that was actively hostile, a cold that broke things. It froze trees solid until they cracked apart with reports like rifle shots. It found every crack and flaw in the well-built homes of Providence Gulch and turned them into conduits of misery. In town, confidence shattered within the first 24 hours. Roofs, built for normal snow loads, began to groan and sag under the immense, heavy drifts. Mr. Finch's assay office was the first to go, its roof collapsing with a great roar of splintering timber. Chimneys, battered by the wind and choked with ice, failed to draw. Houses filled with blinding, acrid smoke, forcing families to put out their precious fires and face the killing cold without heat. The neat stacks of firewood, the pride of every homeowner, became useless, buried under 10 feet of snow as hard as concrete. Livestock, sheltered in barns that were now as cold as the outdoors, began to die. The sounds of the storm were punctuated by the panicked lowing of freezing cattle. The community's preparations, their collective wisdom on how to survive a mountain winter, proved to be a fragile fantasy. They had prepared for winter. They had not prepared for this. But up on the mountainside, inside the folly, there was calm. Deep within the rock, the scream of the wind was a distant hum, a rumor of a world gone mad. The tons of snow piling up outside were just more insulation. Ilara's fire pit, fed by the earth's own warmth, burned steadily, its smoke drawn invisibly away into the heart of the mountain. The massive stone walls, having absorbed heat for months, now radiated it back into the cavern, creating a stable, life-sustaining warmth. The chickens clucked, unconcerned. The goat, having given birth to 2 healthy kids a week prior, rested peacefully with her young. The pale green shoots of kale in the garden wall grew, oblivious to the white death gripping the world outside. Ilara moved through her routine, her actions deliberate and calm. She was not fighting the storm. She had built a world where the storm did not exist. She was an island of order in an ocean of chaos. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, Boro began to bark. It was not the sharp, aggressive bark he used for wolves, but a confused, urgent sound. He stood at the heavy door, whining and scratching. Ilara quieted him, pressing her ear to the wood. Over the distant howl of the wind, she heard a sound, a desperate, rhythmic banging. Someone was outside. She braced the door and pulled it open a crack. A figure, more a shape of snow and ice than a man, fell forward into the opening. She dragged him inside, away from the clawing wind, and slammed the door shut. She rolled him onto his back and brushed the ice from his face. It was Brant, the trapper, who had mocked her. His face was a mask of frostbite, his lips blue and cracked. He was delirious, muttering about lost traps and the fury of the storm. He had been caught out when it hit, and had been wandering for 2 days, lost and freezing, trying to make it back to town. He had seen the faint, flickering glow of the lantern she kept in a shielded alcove by her entrance, a tiny beacon of hope in the maelstrom. It had saved his life. Ilara faced a choice. Here was one of her tormentors, helpless at her feet. The memory of his cruel grin, of his shouted insults, was fresh in her mind. Her stores of food and firewood were carefully rationed, meant for one person and her animals, not for visitors. Every log she burned for him was one less for herself. It would be easy, so easy, to let the cold finish what it had started. But as she looked down at his frost-bitten face, she saw not a mocker, but a man at the edge of death. And in his desperate, rambling words, she heard something that chilled her more than the storm. Silas's girl, the fever, house is so cold. Silas Gable's daughter was sick, and their grand house, the finest in Providence Gulch, was freezing. The choice was never really a choice, not for her. She had built this life to survive, not to harbor vengeance. She stripped off Brant's frozen outer clothes and wrapped him in blankets, placing him as close to the fire as was safe. She forced warm broth between his lips. She saved him not because he deserved it, but because she could. When he was stable, she made another choice. She went to her indoor stockpile of dry, seasoned pine and oak. She loaded a heavy sled she had built from salvaged timbers. She piled it high with firewood, wrapped precious heated stones from her hearth in burlap, and filled a large kettle with more broth. She wrapped herself in every layer she owned, pulled a hood over her head, and harnessed Boro to the front of the sled to help break a trail. Then, with Brant's barely coherent directions as her only guide, she opened the door and plunged back into the white hell of the storm, this time to save the family of the man who had cast her out. The journey to town was a nightmare. The wind was a solid wall that threatened to tear her from her feet. The snow was so deep she had to fight for every step. Boro was magnificent, straining in his harness, finding a path where none existed. Twice she fell into drifts so deep she thought she would be buried alive. But the thought of the sick child, of a community freezing in the dark, drove her forward. When Brant had first regained consciousness in her shelter, his eyes had widened in stunned disbelief. He stared at the scene around him, the gentle warmth radiating from the stone, the soft light of the fire, the impossible sight of green plants growing on the wall, the calm sounds of the animals. He could not speak. He could only stare, his mind struggling to reconcile the Fisher witch's hole in the ground with this place of impossible warmth and life. He had seen a miracle, and it had broken his pride. Now that shock was repeated when Ilara, a ghost emerging from the blizzard, kicked open the frozen door of Silas Gable's grand home. The house was cavernous and dark. The air was frigid, colder inside than out, because the wind had been blocked. Silas and his wife were huddled in the master bedroom with their daughter, buried under a mountain of expensive but uselessly cold quilts. The girl's breathing was shallow, her face flushed with fever. Silas Gable looked up, and his face, already pale with fear, turned ashen with shock. He saw Ilara covered in snow and ice, dragging a sled laden with the one thing in the world he could not buy: heat. He saw the firewood. He saw the steam rising from the kettle. He saw survival, delivered by the woman he had publicly shamed and left for dead. The shame that broke over him was absolute. His wealth, his status, his fine house, all of it was meaningless in the face of the storm. He had been a king in a world of rules and commerce. In this new world of pure survival, he was a pauper. He looked at Ilara, at her scarred hands and her fierce, determined eyes, and the artifice of his pride crumbled to dust. His voice was a raw, broken whisper. "We were wrong, Ilara," he said, the words catching in his throat. "My God, we were all the fools." Ilara did not offer a word of triumph or reproach. Her victory was not in his admission, but in her action. "The child needs warmth," she said, her voice cutting through the frozen air. "Start a fire." She did not gloat. She did not lecture. She simply provided. She helped Silas get a fire going in the frozen hearth with the dry wood she had brought. She warmed the stones and placed them around the sick child. She ladled out hot broth for the family. Her grace was a quiet, powerful force, more damning to their pride than any accusation could have been. She had saved them, and in doing so, had shown them the true measure of their own character, and of hers. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, Providence Gulch was a broken town. It was Ilara who organized the survivors. Using her shelter as a base, she led teams to dig out trapped families, to distribute her stockpiled food and firewood, and attend to the sick. The people who had called her Fisher Witch now followed her commands without question. They saw the truth. She had not just survived, she had mastered the very forces that had nearly destroyed them. In the weeks that followed, the town began to heal, but its relationship with Ilara was transformed forever. The derisive nicknames were retired, spoken only with shame. People now referred to her home simply as the Hearth, a place of legendary warmth and safety. Silas Gable, humbled and diminished, made a public apology before the town council and retreated from public life, his authority shattered. People began to make the journey up to her claim, not with mockery, but with offerings of trade and questions. They wanted to see her systems, to understand her methods. They brought her tools, cloth, and seeds, and in return she gave them knowledge. She showed them how to read the land, how to build with stone for thermal mass, how to find the natural advantages hidden in the landscape. She taught them that a home was not just a box placed upon the earth, but a partnership with it. Her story spread beyond the gulch. Travelers and prospectors carried the tale of the woman who heated her home from the belly of the earth, who grew a garden in the dark of winter. Her methods began to influence how new settlers built their homesteads throughout the high country. They built lower into hillsides, using stone and earth as insulation. The dugout style, once seen as a poor man's hovel, became a mark of wisdom. The landscape itself began to change, dotted with homes that were smarter, safer, and more resilient. Years later, Ilara stood at the entrance of the hearth on a calm summer evening, watching the sunset paint the peaks in hues of orange and purple. Her home was no longer a simple cavern, but a sprawling, thriving homestead, with expanded animal pens, a larger garden, and even a small forge where she worked metal. Boro, now old and gray of muzzle, lay at her feet. The town below was rebuilt, stronger and wiser than before. She was no longer an outcast, but a respected elder, a quiet legend. She had been stripped of everything and given a worthless piece of rock, but she had seen what no one else could see. She had found the mountain's hidden warmth and made it her own. She had built a life not from what she was given, but from what had been discarded, proving that the strongest foundations are not built of stone and timber, but of an unbreakable will and a spirit that refuses to be broken.